The ego is the system that runs your sense of self. It is made out of thought patterns, emotions, and behavioral loops, and the stories that try to hold it all together. Left unchecked, it creates endless existential searching, chronic disconnection, and the persistent sense that something is wrong. The goal of my videos is clarity, to see your identity and its contradictions for what they are, named precisely, to finally understand what it is that we're all running away from. What drives people to spirituality and philosophy is the problem of evil, the fact that evil exists at all and that we must suffer through it, the fact that anybody can do horrible things on this world, and there's no way to kind of prevent that. Like, there will always be suffering that is created through other people. And when I was a Christian, I always thought that it didn't really make sense that all of this evil exists. At least when I really started looking into it, I couldn't believe that a benevolent God would allow for such a thing. And then philosophy was a way to kind of deal with the fact that evil exists. And it made me lose my belief in God altogether. Because how could a God exist and then at the same time allow all of the atrocities that are being allowed right now? In the Bible, there is talk about the original sin, Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, wanting to be like God, and therefore unleashing all this evil into the world, but also unleashing the freedom to be everywhere in this world. If you think about it, logically, God must have known that Eve would bite the fruit of knowledge. And therefore, God must be complicit in all the evil that is created. There's no way you can offload the responsibility as an all-knowing deity to your own creation and then say it's your fault that all of this evil stuff is happening now. Because I told you what you shouldn't do and you did it anyway, despite me knowing better. It's like a parent putting drugs in the eyesight of their children and then the child takes it, and now you are like punishing your child for the rest of your life. You're not just punishing the child for the rest of his or her life, but for generations and generations, for thousands of years. All of the generations are now cursed. This is the most obvious act of evil unleashing onto the world ever. And if you frame it like this, then the idea that the world that we are born in right now is kind of like God's confrontation with evil is kind of a reasonable framing. Now, again, I'm using these mythological stories to exemplify things. I don't believe that this is literally what happened, but I do believe that these myths reveal a lot about the nature of our consciousness, our nature of ourselves as humans, and how we relate to our existential conundrum. In a real way, we are or must be God's confrontation with his own evil desires. The freedom that we are allowed to experience in this world is the freedom to hurt another, to kill, to pillage, to abuse, to mistreat, to use everything for our own gain. And depending on what life you live, you can do so almost without much consequences. I would argue that most people who commit acts of evil, which again is something that we might still have to define better at the course of this video, but these acts then are also part of whatever God has created in this world, and they are also the freedom that is kind of like the entire deal of this place. Because if you cannot do certain things, like eat and kill, then this entire world breaks apart. So you might say that the tenet of freedom must include evil within it, or it couldn't be freedom. In this way, there's no way that heaven, like a perfect place with peace and harmony, can exist if there doesn't exist also a hell where all the torture is possible and you can enact them, and you can even enact on it and be pleased by it. And this is what is so morbid about the nature of evil. It's the infliction of harm on another and then experiencing the joy of harming another. That's what makes it so dark. And we kind of understand this intuitively ourselves, even if we might rejected. In German, there's a word called Schadenfreude, which is literally a word that describes the pleasure you gain from another person's misfortune. Like when somebody falls and you just have to laugh because the way they fell was just kind of silly. And this has different levels, right? Like they top off on pure jealousy, where you just want to see somebody else's life destroyed and feel joy from the destruction of somebody else's life. Now, in spirituality, it is often said that God is unconditional love and acceptance, and he accepts everything equally. This is kind of a tenet in many religions. And although a lot of religions might do some or insert some nuances here, like in my understanding in Islam, God is not an unconditional loving entity. Although, yes, in its core, like you can always move towards him, but there are like a lot of addendums there where things get kind of clarified. But you might argue that the Christian Bible does this too. The thing is that in these like new age spiritual movements, and also in Buddhism and Hinduism, you always have this idea of a completely unconditional loving God. And when I was a Christian, it's also the idea that I had of God. And from a normal human perspective, you might always say, okay, but if you are like all loving, then why would you torture your own creation? And just from a raw, logical, mechanical perspective, like just ignoring all the feeling aspects or the religious aspects or what you might believe in, by definition, if God truly is all loving, then he must love evil as well. He must love, in some shape or form, torture as well. Everything evil that we humans commit must be a part of God and unconditionally accepted if God is an all-loving entity. And in this way, and this is very scary to think about for a lot of people, you might say that when somebody commits an evil act, this is a part of God experiencing what it is like to be the devil, to experience what it is like to commit something that goes against its nature. And the only way it could do such a thing is if it is forgetting his unity with all things, like his all-loving connection unity with all things, and separates itself through hatred and delusion. So God must literally forget that his nature is love, reject itself, and then hurt itself, and then find this experience pleasurable on the personal layer. And then on the meta layer, you must be able to zoom out, look at it, and then say, I love that this is possible. I love that we can live like this. I love that freedom includes even the most horrendous parts of myself. Because if not, what would be the other option? What would a world without duality look like? What would a world without freedom look like? Is there any world at all? Is there anything to explore about ourselves if we are forced to restrict what we are capable of? If our potential is restricted because we fear that by moving through that restriction, we are going to act evil, then we dim ourselves down. Then we lose ourselves in our shells and don't express what we really want. We don't go for what we really desire. We don't think out loud what we are really wanting to say. We let other people go over our boundaries and don't set a firm boundary ourselves. Society convinces you that your own boundary enforcement is evil, and then it enforces their own boundaries or their own conquering of your own boundaries and desires. And even this entire mechanism is part of all of the freedom that we are given in this world to manipulate and cheat, to lie and deceive, to deceive ourselves and deceive others, and use others for our gain. Now, all of this on the meta level must be part of unconditional loving acceptance. And this is why things are how they are. Because the unconditional nature of all things, or of unconditional love, includes absolutely everything. And morality is often being used as a way to control other people. And that's what it has been for most of human history. Now, this conversation would be incomplete if we don't define what evil then actually means, because in the way I'm painting it, I'm painting this position as a complete moral relativist, right? I'm pretending that morality doesn't really exist because on the highest level, there's actually no one there to judge you because everything is accepted. And this is very scary for most people to accept because we are full of judgment and full of wanting to judge. And this kind of strips it all away. And then also, where's the hierarchy, right? Where is good and where's evil? Like, it exist in some shape or form if we have all of these intuitions about this stuff. Evil does exist. And we kind of understand what it is intuitively because we are drawn to it. We're drawn to the word. We're drawn to the conflict. And we're drawn to our own confusion towards it. There's something that we're circling around whenever we mention it, or when we come in direct contact with it, the feeling is very visceral. Now, a lot of people might look at something as evil that doesn't really have this quality, and it is more their own personal judgment being projected onto a thing. And then objective evil is more an ego narrative than actual reality. But through their own ego architecture, it's being experienced as objective reality. This would include that if God exists, then he also has the freedom to create complete made-up moral frameworks from the ground up just by being an individual. So you could theoretically create a universe where things are objectively bad if you have a society in which everybody agrees that this is objectively bad. Like in the Islamic religion, not being able to eat pork. And the feeling towards this is objective. It's not like a subjective interpretation. Now, it is commanded by a god that is seen as an extension of themselves. And you can see how deep this like ego architecture goes because it extends to a sense of universality that triumphs any individual perspective. And this is how we use morality in order to control others. But still, this doesn't really bring us closer to a sense of objective evil, because eating pork, maybe you can connect it to veganism, but that's not the point at all. The objectivity of evil should be, in my eyes, something that every human can agree upon. And most people have like a certain philosophy within them where they are very convinced that moral relativism is true. And I think I made a good argument for why moral relativism makes sense, at least in like the way things manifest. But you can see me in many videos, or also when I talk to people or in the comment section, talk like somebody who believes in objective morality. And what I'd argue is that the word belief isn't really the right way to look at it. I would say that real morality is something that is being recognized. It is something that is seen. And like anybody who would tell this to you would tell you that they see the objective morality, right? They see the truth because they are in direct contact with the God that actually has established these truths. What I would argue is that you don't do that. To have an objective sense of morality, you actually need to strip away all subjective interpretations of the truth. You actually don't want to infer anything by anybody. Like, you don't need an authority at all. The only thing that you actually need to get that unites us all is the fact that unnecessary suffering inflicted on another is evil. Or also, unnecessary suffering is bad. Therefore, unnecessary suffering you could classify as evil. But mostly when we talk about evil, we talk about an act. So it's more like if you commit, like if you torture a baby, then it is very hard pressed to have a philosophical debate if this is good or bad. Like we can have all of these philosophical arguments, but there are clear lines that we can draw where we intuitively get that this just makes things worse. And what makes something worse is the suffering. And the suffering doesn't need any belief. all you need is sort of realistic perspective or a realistic view of reality, where you can acknowledge that despite all relativizing we can do with different perspective and consciousness, reality exists, and reality is real. And it is known precisely through pain that this is in fact the case. Suffering is the immediate, absolute, strongest, obvious evidence for reality to be the case. And then all sort of relativistic philosophies, to a certain extent, want to deny their own pain and their own suffering. And then they use a sort of notion that you cannot really have contact with true reality because pain is being dismissed as a sort of false reality or a false projection of reality. And it is very conflicting, right? Because seeing that pain is part of an illusion is very deep spiritual wisdom as well. There's deep insight in recognizing that, yes, it is your brain that is creating your pain. And on top of it, it is your brain's ego that is creating your suffering. It is the way you are relating to that pain. This is the reason for why the true nature of things ends up being non-dual, because you can always polarize both sides of any argument, go on both sides of an equation, and then you enter at null. You are again at point zero, where both perspectives are realizable. That's also why these contradictions can exist simultaneously, because duality is real, and this is why you can build an entire life where you are objectively certain that playing video games is a moral sin. You can build whatever structure you want, and you'll have some sort of moral framework on top of it, and then it will become real to you precisely because duality is possible, and existence can commit fully to a thing. You can both experience absolute utmost humility in front of the realization of your own existence, and you can feel the most ego god aggrandizement by realizing the nature of your own existence, and both can be felt fully. And here again we come to this mythological idea of God unconditionally accepting everything, meaning that he himself can accept himself in a state of absolute humbleness or humility and absolute authority, absolute submission and absolute dominance, absolute beauty, awe, and goodness, virtue, and depravity and pure evil. And this duality manifests through the reality of suffering that exists and is manifested because we have eaten from the tree of knowledge. This means that we are kind of the confrontation of God himself, wondering if what we are doing here is actually also good or not. Like, couldn't we build something better? Could we do something purer? Something that is better for all instances of us? And can we poke at the thing that has forgotten our true nature, our inconnectivity with all, the part that is inflicting suffering on itself unnecessarily, and correct it over time?